that?
I did.
You did? Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, you guys are fine. Who will, okay, is that how you're going to stay far apart?
Yeah.
Just remember, you got to move, whoever speaks, got to shift.
Also got to keep moving.
I guess because you got to be in front of the microphone. So if you can just maybe.
Who's speaking first?
I will be speaking first.
He's
so
mostly going to be
would you-
speaking.
Sure.
She's here for questions portion of it.
Maybe just have you sit in the middle, and maybe just have you a little bit to the side and just switch. Does that make sense? Just have like you sit right there and her sit.
Spill the crap.
Sorry. Just
I've never been told nobody could hear me before. So.
Sorry to make
No
it
comments
difficult.
either.
No comments on the peanut gallery?
Yeah.
We love you, Dave.
So I keep my mask on. And
Yeah, that's fine. While I'm speaking, I'm not. You guys got all your angles?
Where are you ready, Steve?
Okay, well, I just wanted to start off by saying thank you for showing up. What we're going to be going over today is I just wanted to give a little bit of a background on how this case, again, we're talking about the Ehle-Barnett Funeral Home investigation, how it started, where we're at right now, and just to try to put some of the families and public at ease. Cases like this are kind of unique, but they are also not the normal procedures or not the normal things we see day to day, so don't paint all funeral homes to be the same as one bad apple. Basically, Monday, January 10th, we started with a complaint to the public health from family members wishing to find out where a loved one was that was picked up by Mr. Barnett and was supposed to be cremated. After further checks with the crematories, there was no record of a body being located or being transported to any of the crematoriums. So detectives had reached out and tried to make contact with Mr. Barnett. We were unavailable or unable to make contact with him right away. He did respond to detectives, stating that he still had the family member in question and that he would produce the body for detectives to ID. And eventually there was a meeting set up where detectives met with Mr. Barnett at the funeral home. The body was there. At that point, detectives contacted the Fulton County coroner's office, who's here today, as far as to take hold of the remains. While we were waiting for Mr. Barnett to respond back to us, investigators were looking into and researching through New York State whether we had heard that he did not have a license. He, in fact, did not have a license, but it was actually he had a valid license to operate as a funeral director until November 29th of 2022. He signed a stipulation order with the state in October of, 2021. It wasn't until he received a copy of that stipulation is when the order took effect, and that was signed for on the 29th of November. We further learned that the funeral home itself was not registered as of June of 2021, which meant they could not store any bodies, they could not do any prep work or anything else in that funeral home. And as the case progressed in the background, detectives also, in speaking with a patrol officer who was working that day, notified them that he had done a traffic stop of Mr. Barnett and that there was a box or a casket in the back of the vehicle at that time, and that traffic stop was on January 6th of 2021. So after meeting with Mr. Barnett, the body was recovered. The identification was verified through a photograph the family had provided us with the body. The body was turned over to the coroner's office, and I believe it was through family and the coroner, the body was transported by A.G. Cole, another local funeral home. And I would like to say that Cole's Funeral Home has been very cooperative with us. They've been a big help in not only the paperwork end, but also knowing we are not funeral directors, nor do I care to get into that field. So knowing what the norms are, what the process that has to be followed, where we can find records and what records have to be filed has been a huge help to us. So that's how Cole's got involved. They had volunteered. Again, if we found more bodies, we could use their facilities for the storage and make sure everything was done properly and according to law. So after the initial inquest, as far as the first human remains that we found, once they were removed, the officers had no, and detectives had no reason to continue a search of anything else, so they left the premises. Shortly that afternoon or that evening into the next morning, which had been Tuesday, we learned from another family complaint that there was possibly another human remains that was picked up by Mr. Barnett and that was not taken to the crematorium. So after researching and looking for that individual, we found and verified that the body had never made it to the crematorium, and it was at that time that the detectives drew up a search warrant application, and we presented a search warrant application on Friday morning to County Court Judge Michael Smirdick, who authorized the search. Once we had the search warrant, detectives and patrol officers went to the residence, knocked and announced themselves for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we executed the search warrant after getting no response. While conducting the search, Mr. Barnett appeared from another portion of the property. I believe he was upstairs. At that point in time, he was detained. One of the officers and detectives noticed a box within viewing areas that had the name of the person that we were looking for, as far as the second family member, their family that was missing a family member. So at that point, Mr. Barnett was transported to the Johnstown Police Department for questioning, and detectives continued on with the search. Search of the box did in fact have human remains, and again at that point the coroner's office was contacted, and we proceeded to search the rest of the property to include the building and the garage. At the conclusion of the search warrant, there was 3 human remains that were recovered from the property. So when we talked before about 4 human remains, the first one again was a voluntary, basically turnover on a Monday, and then Friday there was 3 more human remains that were recovered, and 18 cremated remains, 12 of which we had some either labeling or names on them, and 6 that were unknown boxes were recovered during the execution of the search warrant. All the human remains were turned over by the county coroner to A.G. Cole Funeral Home. We just want to say that to all the families of all of the human remains have been spoken to. They're well aware of the situation. A.G. Cole has promised and dedicated their services as far as we're going to make sure that all families will get the proper remains returned to them after cremation, and also we'll make sure all the paperwork is straightened out through New York State procedures that have to be filed, because there are some issues with the paperwork that just need to be straightened out, so we do it all legal and correct. At that point, on the couple of the human remains, we had reached out and we requested assistance from the New York State Police Forensic Unit to aid us in the identifying process. So we have been in touch with them. We've met with them at the funeral home, and they have been assisting us in making sure that we have who we think we have as far as human remains. At this point in time, we have currently sent charges to city court. We're waiting to hear from our judges whether or not they have to recuse themselves, or who would be reviewing the charges. But at the current time, we have plans on charging 3 counts of concealment of a corpse, a Class E felony. We have 1 count of grand larceny, which is a D felony, 2 counts of endangering the welfare of a child, which is a Class A misdemeanor, and 3 other charges that all fall under the public health law. The 1 count of operating a funeral home without a license, 4 counts of operating, 4 count, operating as a funeral director without a license, and the failing to bury or incinerate within a reasonable amount of time of death, another public health law, and that will be 3 counts, 3 counts of that charge. So at the current time, with the calls, emails, and communications we're receiving from the public, we have 18 new case based on complaints that we're still trying to research. This case is still open, it's still ongoing. I'm sure there will be probably more charges that are possible, and we will proceed through with the courts as we have to going forward. Right now, our main concern is to get family members some closure on what we've recovered, and try to put families at ease if they are worried about if in fact, or what happened to their loved ones, or if they've got the right ashes. Those types of things, it's going to take us a while to go through all the identification processes and everything. But we are working at it. We also will be, on our end, as far as law enforcement, we'll be digging into the financials to see what money was actually paid for services, what was not. And again, our job now is going to be with some of these cases, if it was services that were provided just not adequate, that could be just a civil matter. If it was services weren't rendered because they pocketed the money and didn't provide them, then that becomes a crime. So at that point, again, to my left is Coroner Margaret Luck from the Fulton County Coroner's Office. So if there's any questions.
Chief, why was Mr. Barnett's license revoked in November 2021?
Why?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. You'd have to check with the state on that.
What is his status now? Has he had an arraignment?
No, he was taken for evaluation. He was taken to St. Mary's Hospital for evaluation the day of the execution of the search warrant, so I'm not sure if he's still at St. Mary's Hospital or if he's out.
Are you at liberty to say why he was evaluated?
No.
Chief, how far back should family be concerned? Like, how long is it?
The actual criminal end, I believe, we're looking at probably from June on. But again, from June to
June of 2020?
June of 2021, I believe it was when the funeral home was not registered. From that point till November, he was still able to work as a funeral director, but he was working under another funeral home's name, Ellison Beckering. So there's some cases that, because he couldn't store a body, they were, he was allowed to operate under his license, and it wasn't until his license was actually suspended that Beckering and Ellis have cut all contact or connections with him at that point. So that's part of the process that we're going through now, is trying to figure out between the different crematoriums that are around and what license was what done under what services. So.
Chief, there are two names on the funeral home. Is Mr. Barnett the only principal responsible for this?
Yes, Ale and Barnett, Ale had sold the property and the business to Brian Barnett.
And how long had he run that operation?
I don't know specifics. I know it's been at least like 8 or 9 years that he's been out of that business. But again, I believe he stayed on working for Mr. Barnett for a couple of years until Barnett got on his feet, but I'm not positive on that.
Have you established a motive for this?
All so far, there's really nothing we can show as far as motive except for the need for money.
You mentioned a welfare, the child charge. Can you talk a little bit about what that stems from?
The improper bodies that were left around with children's toys and in areas where the children were in the residence had access to and had to pass by. So you have the health risk and everything else of a decaying body to, so that's what based us to charge him with endangering.
So there was a child inside the residence?
Yes.
Chief, we were told that families had concerns about this funeral home back in May. Did you get any complaints back then?
No, to my knowledge, I believe they might have been, I know there was complaints that were filed with the state, but we have not been notified of anything until basically the recent cases where, and a lot of it was through the county attorney, or the county coroner's office had reached out to us, to assist them in locating remains. So.
And do you know or have a number for how many families in total have filed complaints?
I don't have a total. I know right now, like I said, we are up to 18 new cases, so you're probably around 30 cases right now that we're actively trying to track down.
We have some families that reached out to us from 2020 that, how do they know if they can get their loved one's ashes? How do they know if those were, they're saying stems back from 2020?
That's what I'm working on.
Yeah, she's working on that now. I mean,
Can I just clarify
Yep.
one thing? Okay, the remains are in the custody of the coroner's office, not A.G. Cole.
Okay,
I just
yeah,
want to make
well,
sure that
right.
you understand that I have them and I would be releasing them after I'm able to identify and I have to be like 200% sure. So nothing's being released until I can identify everything that I do have.
Did any of these people die of COVID, and is there any concern for spread of the disease?
So at this point, I'm looking at cremations now.
And do any of the...
And we do still take precautions, so...
And do any of the children or family members have any direct contact with the remains?
I have no idea. I can't answer that.
Chief, you mentioned that the motive was the need for money. Can you elaborate on that a little? Was the business financially strapped?
I have not seen any of the financial records yet. That's just based on what we've been told so far was short on money. So I don't know if it's a greed thing or if it's a need thing. So that's something that through the course of this investigation, when we start getting financial records and doing a deeper dive into the records, we'll probably have a better handle of it then.
Along those lines, did Mr. Barnett have any employees who may have had knowledge of this situation?
No, to my knowledge, the only person it's when he worked with another funeral home. I don't recall him having any other employees except for Mr. Ale, who assisted him early on. So I haven't heard of anybody else that would have had knowledge.
And when you did see Mr. Barnett or anyone from the police department, did he seem unfit, unwell? Any signs of...
There were certain concerns and signs that, that's what kind of led to the evaluation. So, but I'm not going to get into too much more of that as far as...
Has your department had a chance to actually interview Mr. Barnett?
Yes, he was interviewed.
Okay.
How old is Mr. Barnett?
That I'm not,
35.
I was going to say, I'm not sure of. I know he's younger, but
Does he have a lawyer?
to my knowledge, I have not heard of him seeking a lawyer. I'm not sure if he's going to, I'm sure he's going to retain one. I just don't know who.
Maybe.
I know 2 others have retained lawyers, so, but he's not one of them.
Who is in charge of regulating or keeping eyes on funeral homes to make sure that they're in compliance?
New York State Funeral Bureau. New York State Funeral Bureau oversees the operations of all the funeral homes. So they would be the ones.
So you said there's 18 new cases and a total of 30 cases that your department is currently looking at?
Yes. Well, just so you're clear, they're coroner cases. We're assisting her as far as identifications, interviews.
So we have the remains, and then what I'm adding in is the families that are contacting me looking for theirs, because I'm still trying to identify what I do have.
How
So
would you possibly identify a person who has been cremated?
we have containers, so we're looking up the permit numbers or their names and whatever else I can find. And
That
then
assumes that the paperwork was done correctly.
the containers all have, your cremation containers would have the name on the box, the inside container, and then inside that container. I've reviewed everything and got, some had the number on the inside, some had, so it's a mixture of things, and now I'm verifying. It's going to take a long process, but it's verifying. It's going to take a long time.
Is there any type of inspection by the state or local employees once the license is revoked? So, the license is revoked in November. Did you guys know about that? Or
No, we were never told. We would not, the coroner's office, I know, would not be aware of a facility has been terminated as far as their licensing go. I think that should have been up to the funeral bureau to announce.
So clarify, how many remains were there totally of persons?
Four.
Four
actual
human remains.
Four actual remains.
Yes.
How many were actually urns?
Then additional to that, then I believe there was
We had 18.
18.
We had 12 that either had some names or recognition numbers as far as permit numbers, those type of things that we could verify through the crematorium. And there was 6 that we're not sure who it might have been or if it is human remains or not. And then, again, there was more cases coming forward of
people are coming.
people are asking about human remains.
6 not identified at this moment.
Actually, none of them I identified until I get confirmation. So I'm going to let you know that right now, nobody's been identified at this point. None, even if the box has a name on it, I still have to verify everything.
Typically, how long would it take from the point of cremation until the time when family members receive the ashes?
Typically, I've seen personally 7 to 10 days at the most,
Some less.
depending on holidays or, days of the week that the body's picked up. If it's on a weekend, it might, but generally...
But if they can't get them back after a week, that the family should,
So it sounds like perhaps the families didn't follow up and contact the funeral home and say, hey, where's my loved one?
I don't know all of them as far as what their wishes were. Like some people want to have their cremations remain there so that when they pass away, they're together. It's not unlikely for a funeral home not to have a cremation there because somebody didn't either bother picking them up or for any reason. I'm not a director. So it's not unusual to have these cremation remains there. That's where I've got to follow up, and that's where I have to reach out to the family and find out if they wanted them back or not.
So is there a crematorium on site at that funeral home?
No, there's only 3 in the area, I think.
Yeah.
And is Mr. Barnett getting arraigned today, or is...
Oh, I don't know.
We are still waiting for a warrant to be signed for those charges I just gave out. Once the city court assigns a judge to him, just because he is a local individual, we're not sure if our city court judge and assistant city court judge have to recuse themselves. Then we'll reach out to the city of Gloversville judges, and if not, we'll go to city of Amsterdam and locate a judge that doesn't have a conflict and can take the case. They'll review the charges and either give us an arrest warrant or not. And once that's done, then we'll actively see if Mr. Barnett is in fact out or not. So
Right now, you don't know if he's still in St. Mary's or not.
it's nothing we'd be told.
Okay.
And even if we call down to inquire, they're not going to tell us. So
Sir, can you describe the scene as far as where the decomposing bodies were and stuff like that? Was it
I wasn't there for the execution of the search warrant, so I am not going to go into, you know, any of the specifics on that end. Anything else?
What's your message to families?
The message to families is, I mean, obviously, we're willing to work with you. You just got to be patient because we think this is more of a limited, like a last 6 months type thing. I know there's people trying to go back to 2019, 2020. We're not saying this services weren't performed correctly, but there's nothing that we would have had knowledge that it was, you know, criminal on that end. So again, there's a big difference between not getting the services that you think you paid for. That's a civil matter. That's nothing we're going to, you know. So we're trying to stick with the ones where, you know, we don't actually know where our loved one is type of thing, or whether, you know, they told us we could pick up the remains and they weren't there. Whatever that case is, that would help us and try to at least identify, you know, if there's actually ashes or remains missing, or if it was just, you know, somebody else picked them up. I've gotten a couple emails where family members were looking, and then upon checking within their own family, they find out that, you know, their grandfather had picked up the remains and never told anybody. So, you know, basically we're looking at pretty much the last 6 months would be the ones we were most concerned with. And if anything, if we come across anything through financial records, through we have seized some records from on the search warrant from the funeral home. So if we have questions, we will reach out to family members. But basically, we're looking for, you know, family members that may think their remains would have been left there for some reason if somebody didn't pick them up or whatever, just to reach out to us, you know, and we'll be getting back. It's just it's kind of overwhelming right now. She's only one person, and I've got 3 new detectives, and they've been flat out since last Monday. So we're trying to get there. It's just going to be a while for us before we even see financial records and everything else on subpoenas. So.
Chief, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's all that one's fault right there.
Good, how you been?
Chief, was there a news release that's been prepared or not?
For this? No, I'm going to be preparing one later on, and I'll get it back out.
Okay.
I know some people didn't get the first one, so that's why I just wanted to go from one.